This episode of UnHerd TV is supported by Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management is one of the top 10 independent wealth managers in the UK. They offer a fully integrated wealth management solution that combines wealth planning from their team of independent financial advisors with investment portfolio services from expert investment managers. To find out how Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management can help you build your wealth with confidence, visit candowealth.com. Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. I'm Florence Reed. Looking back at the pandemic, critics of government policy will often refer to the corporate interests involved in recommending certain public measures, from lockdowns to masking. We've covered many of them on this channel. Today we're taking a deep dive into the very opaque and controversial question of the motives behind the unprecedented vaccine mandates that became normalised over the COVID era. Lee Fang, formerly an investigative reporter at The Intercept, was at the vanguard of some of the biggest scoops of the last decade. He's now the proud owner of, you guessed it, a Substack, where he documents the corruption of public policy by corporate interests, particularly over the COVID era. I collared him downstairs in our lovely cafe and convinced him to come up and talk to me about Big Pharma, one of my pet subjects. Happily, he said yes. He joins me live in the studio now. Welcome to London, Lee.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I was really interested in getting you up here into the studio because you've written a big report about Pfizer, which I feel like flew under the radar in many ways and actually is something really significant that, looking back over the COVID years, might tell us a bit more than we think about what interests, corporate interests in particular, were guiding a lot of the public policy during that time. I've got here a list of Pfizer's charitable donations, which is what the report really sinks its teeth into, which we'll get to in a second. But first, I just wanted to ask you about vaccine mandates, as I said there in my introduction. Could you just, for our uninitiated audience, or perhaps our UK or rest of world audience, tell us a little bit about what happened in America across the COVID pandemic when it came to vaccine mandates?
Well, back in 2021, as the vaccines were being rolled out in the United States, there were a number of mandates. Various institutions, major universities, corporations instituted their own internal mandates. Cities like where I'm from in San Francisco had a mandate, New York, various states. And then most controversially, the federal government in the fall of 2021 rolled out their mandate for essentially every employer with over 100 employees. And although each of these mandates differed in some of their particular rules, they generally stated that if you did not receive and take the COVID vaccine, you would be dismissed from your job. There were some, carve-outs for, at least for the federal government mandate. You could be tested, once a week or multiple times a week. These mandates, very controversial at the time, still very controversial. They led to thousands of people being fired and dismissed from their jobs. They did not generally have any exceptions for natural immunity from prior infection. So folks who, especially essential workers who, were on the front lines of this crisis, many of them were the first to be infected, especially in the transportation industry. A lot of those workers were protesting these mandates because they said, look, we have natural immunity. We shouldn't be required to receive this shot, to have a job and put food on the table. I was sympathetic to that. I'm vaccinated, but I feel like that was a very reasonable argument at the time. And you look back at these debates, they were very fraught, at least in the US media, and I know around the world, you were kind of branded as anti-science or pro-science, whether you agreed with the mandates or not. They were not up for debate. You were branded as dangerous for society. If you criticized these mandates, a dangerous right-winger. This was a controversial policy at the time, and it was sold also by the Biden administration, by Joe Biden himself, from our CDC director, many of the kind of top public health officials, claiming that the mandate was necessary because if you received the vaccine, you would not be infected with COVID. You would not spread COVID. At the time, there was no evidence to show that was the case. There were no studies that showed that the vaccine ended transmission, and we now definitely know that the vaccine did not end transmission. Very decent research showing that for vulnerable populations, the vaccine was very efficient in reducing more severe symptoms, but in terms of transmission risk, the evidence wasn't there. So, these mandates were rolled out throughout the summer and fall of 2021. Very controversial, reshaped tens of, if not hundreds of thousands of lives. And I wrote this story recently for my Substack, just kind of like looking in the rearview mirror and looking at some of the interest groups and pharmaceutical interests that seem to have a role in shaping this controversial policy.
Yeah, of course, there is good profit margins to be made and also public health interests involved here. It's quite complicated. It becomes quite an opaque issue because it's hard to tell the difference often or to separate those two motivations. I suppose here when we're talking specifically about Pfizer, there is a very clear reason why Pfizer might be supportive of vaccine mandates. If you mandate a product, if you're Coca-Cola and you say every child in America must drink 1 can of Coca-Cola at lunch every day for the rest of their school lives, well, it's quite good for the profits as well. So you can see here the motivations might be quite complex behind it. But of course, as you say there was a kind of moral element which has confused the whole thing about whether or not it was morally virtuous to be vaccinated and whether that was indeed, as Joe Biden suggested, a kind of 100% effective transmission stop. And that, of course, as you say, has come into grave question.
I think the Coca-Cola example is an interesting one. For any major corporation attempting to sell their product, one aspect, of course, is the price, but the other is a kind of a moral argument. What does it mean to you? How does it kind of sync with public policy? How do you, as a consumer, as a patient, as a citizen, interact with this product? And we really haven't seen a parallel to this in modern American history. I mean, this is the Pfizer vaccine, which was partnered with German company BioNTech. This was the most lucrative pharmaceutical product in human history. There is no parallel. And while Pfizer did not publicly comment on the mandate, I think they understood the public relations risk of endorsing a government mandate requiring the administration and purchase of their product. They seem to have a role in shaping this from the outside, from various community organizations, lobbying groups, and healthcare, civil rights, and consumer organizations that did their lobbying on their behalf. And that gets to my story that you referenced at the beginning of your show. So
let's have a look into some of these lobbying groups and influential kind of campaigners who were funded in some way or given grants by Pfizer. Of course, Pfizer has to release this funding information as part of their open policy of reporting, though, of course, it doesn't mean that the people who've received those donations necessarily have to be totally transparent about what they've received, which is something that we'll come on to in a moment.
Well, and that's actually interesting, too, because in Europe, I know the laws are very different than in the US, and there's a higher degree of scrutiny in terms of pharmaceutical payments to outside physicians, organizations, and community groups. In the US, it's a patchwork of rules and regulations. Pfizer, over 10 years ago, was prosecuted by our Justice Department for engaging in illegal off-label promotion of their drugs, encouraging doctors to prescribe their drugs where there was no kind of regulatory authority. And as part of a settlement from this multi-billion-dollar case, Pfizer was required to engage in additional disclosure. So, they've gotten caught in very similar kind of underhanded lobbying tactics in the past. And because of those settlements they've paid for other drugs, we have a higher degree of disclosure for just this company.
Yeah, though the disclosure isn't being looked at by everyone is the thing. It's very easy to bury this in the back end of Pfizer's incredibly complex website, which has lots of rabbit holes that you can go down, and you have actually taken a look. So when you do take a look, some of the examples are predictable, I suppose. We've got here the American Lung Association, who received almost $400,000 from Pfizer for a pneumonia awareness campaign. Of course, pneumonia being a kind of severe side effect of coronavirus, that would make sense that they want to raise awareness of that severe side effect to promote the cure or the vaccine that they have offered. Then you get to something like the American Academy of Pediatrics, I'm reading here, was given $200,000 for something called Building a System of Care to Improve Patient Compliance. We're talking there about childhood vaccination. And then you get onto this more cultural side of things, which I suppose is something I'd love to speak more to you about. We've got the National Black Nurses Association, who have been targeted for vaccine confidence PSAs. So public announcements to try and encourage black nurses to have higher confidence in applying the vaccine to probably majority black communities. Now, this brings us on to your story of Chicago, in which the Chicago Urban League was dispelling fears publicly about vaccination and privately receiving funding from Pfizer. Can you tell me more about that specific example?
Yeah, this was a big aspect of the debate in the U.S. Is, as lots of cultural and political phenomenons, where there's a big discussion about racial disparity, that in the rollout of these vaccines, some of the most the communities that had the highest levels of vaccine hesitancy were in the African American communities, especially working class African American communities across the country, and particularly in Chicago. Chicago had a municipal COVID mandate, and this was part of the discussion in summer 2021. If you roll out this mandate requiring employers and city jobs and private sector jobs to force the vaccine, will that harm disproportionately African American communities that are declining to take the shot? As this discussion was happening, the Chicago Urban League, this is a very storied civil rights organization. I believe it's over 120 or 130 years old, really on the vanguard of various civil rights campaigns over the years. Their president appeared on local television saying, look, I'm paraphrasing here, but we need even though there will be a disparate impact, this is worth it to have the mandate. During that discussion and similar discussions in Chicago media, no disclosure that her organization, just prior to this debate that year, received a special $100,000 donation from Pfizer. Notably, the Chicago Urban League does a very good job in disclosing almost every single corporate donation to their website except Pfizer. They declined to comment. I reached out to them many times, and if there was no kind of as any kind of nonprofit or NGO group, you have to fundraise from various stakeholders and different donors. I understand that, but if there's no kind of public explanation for this, I think it kind of undermines the trust in these various institutions. Are they acting as a representative of the community? Are they working towards the kind of broad African American community in Chicago, or are they acting as a corporate lobbyist, as an organization with credibility, with a voice in the media that's acting in the interests of their donors? I think that's a reasonable debate to be having. It certainly applies to many other kind of policy issues in the United States, but here I think is a particularly controversial one.
And what we haven't touched on here yet is the very reasonable medical mistrust that those African American communities in places like Chicago may well have because of histories of medical malpractice against black people in the States. We can think about Alabama in the 30s.
There's been quite a few polls done on this, and this has not changed in recent years, but the most unpopular industries in America are oil companies, banks, and pharmaceutical companies. The pharma executives and PR kind of representatives understand this fact. And so when they engage in controversial, highly emotionally charged public policy debates, they're looking to kind of parry any potential attack and harness various kind of cultural and community trends in the United States to their benefit. America is unique also in the sense that we're one of the only Western countries, I think one of the only industrialized countries, that does not have a kind of broad government mechanism to negotiate the price of pharmaceuticals that we pay in the private sector or for retirees. This has been a big source of debate in the United States for a very long time. Where I live in California, there was a measure in 2016, kind of a yes or no referendum, to allow the state to engage in some more kind of price setting regulations for the state kind of welfare program, state healthcare program, Medicaid is what it's called. And pharmaceutical companies saw this, were terrified. They mobilized a massive campaign in California to defeat this measure. They were successful. But if you look at the advertisements that they ran, they were not saying, hey, look, I'm AstraZeneca, I'm Pfizer, and I oppose this message. They funded gay rights groups, Asian American groups, African American groups, in San Francisco, the LGBT Harvey Milk Center, for the gay rights icon.
It does seem often that it's a kind of progressive cause that they hook onto, and I guess the question is why? Why is it?
Well, that's because this is California. This is a state that voted overwhelmingly, and that year for Hillary Clinton.
Would it be the National Rifle Association in Texas? I mean, this is the question. It does seem more likely that they hook onto these progressive ideas. I think maybe because it's about a moral signaling, about the alignment of their product. In this case, the moral virtue of getting vaccinated, being alongside, being anti-racist, pro-gay, whatever it is.
I think it's both. It's multifaceted because in these kind of election, scenarios, you just want to get to 51%. You want to win. And in a state like California, that's highly democratic, the social justice, identity politics has the most cachet that's going to work. But actually in this campaign, California's a big, diverse state. In the Central Valley and some parts of Southern California that are quite conservative, the pharmaceutical companies funded veterans organizations to endorse their position. So, they had a kind of a...
They swing both ways.
Yeah, whatever worked, really. They're not ideologically attached to, social justice causes. They have a fiduciary duty to serve their shareholders, and to serve their shareholders means keeping drug prices high, so they're going to do whatever works. Now, in terms of kind of shaping the larger public debate, especially around these vaccines, attaching to a moral cause, funding these pediatric societies that then hired their lobbyists, that then pushed for, childhood vaccine mandates, that's one part of it. But then also just kind of improving their reputation by attaching themselves to the arts, to other kind of do-gooder, laudable causes. That's also good for business.
We talked there about the fiduciary responsibility, but there is a social and public health responsibility that if you look at the scientists who work on the lower levels of these companies, who are often incredibly intelligent people from Harvard and Yale and Cambridge, many of them saying that they are just trying to do what's best for humanity, that they are creating a product in a childhood vaccine, for example, that's something that will save hopefully millions, if not billions of lives, and that actually theirs is just a moral duty, and the fiduciary responsibility comes from above. It's a kind of superstructure that's unfortunate. It's a side effect of living under capitalism, but it's just how things work. They need the funding to do the research to get the best product.
Pharmaceutical money influences and affects many spheres of American life, and academia is a big one. There are academics that focus their entire lives on solving the greatest problems in human history, and so finding a cure for cancer, and coming up with new medicines every day, and what they do is wonderful and important work, and many of them do receive a mix of public and private financing, including pharma money at times, to do this type of important research work. For a lot of these debates, I think just in terms of the public interest and how we evaluate this work, it's important to have disclosure. We talked about the previous example in Chicago. I think the greatest ill there is the lack of disclosure, that no one, here we are in 2023, we don't find out about this money until now, when years after people were fired from their jobs, that these policies were enacted. For the academics working in the sphere, a greater level of disclosure is important.
Were there whistleblowers? Have you found people who were willing to talk to you about this from inside the organization, or is that just totally stumm?
For this story, no, but I've written many pharmaceutical stories, and there's a lot of corruption in the United States around these issues. And this goes on today. I was just looking at my phone this morning, and Joe Biden enacted kind of we were talking about price regulations nationally, the very first attempt, and it only applies to the top 10 most expensive pharmaceuticals in the country, but that's going to be enacted later this year. It's one of his kind of crowning accomplishments. The pharmaceutical industry filed a lawsuit against this law. A few companies, Bristol Myers Squibb and some others, are leading the charge, but also lots of patient organizations, because patient organizations, again, have more credibility with the public. They receive millions of, these patient organizations that are engaged in this litigation, they receive millions of dollars from the pharmaceutical industry. It's a huge part of just how DC works. So if you've gone to Washington, DC, you see pharmaceutical advertisements all over the city. They're not actually selling a particular medicine. They're just trying to improve the reputation to shape the regulatory and political atmosphere.
Here we have a question of morality, which is if these vaccines were taken by millions of Americans under a certain degree of misleading information coming from the government and then funded by companies like Pfizer, how much can we say that it was informed consent? Informed consent is this phrase that we get a lot when it comes to the question of vaccine mandates. How informed or misinformed do you think the consent was that people were making when they took the vaccine under these conditions?
That's a great question. I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that, but I would love just a thoughtful debate, a public debate about this. You turn on Fox News or MSNBC or any of the kind of cable networks we have in the United States, and it's a slugfest of finger pointing and name calling, kind of just taking apart the science, the motivations, a clear-eyed view of the lobbying and the motivations of the pharmaceutical companies, but still kind of appreciating the great achievements of producing the vaccines in record time is also an important accomplishment. I feel like that there just isn't a balanced debate on any of these issues. You kind of have extremists in different camps, demanding that we, generally on the left, that we accept these mandates and not debate them or debate the science or discuss the efficacy at all. And on the far right, sometimes drifting towards conspiracy theory or exaggerating the adverse effects of the vaccine. I mean, it's just, it's very fraught. And at least I think to less trust on both sides for the next kind of medical or, pandemic emergency where we might be presented with these issues again.
Just in the last few weeks, we've had Joe Rogan, who's attempting to kind of broker some sort of debate between Peter Hotez, who's a scientist, a kind of vaccine scientist, and RFK Jr., a presidential candidate who has got some, to say the least, controversial views on vaccines. We've had him on this very channel, but that has seemed impossible. That there are two entrenched sides, as you say, who are so deep in the quagmire of this question that they will shout over the wall at each other, that to give any platform to someone who is on the other side is to legitimize their perspective and therefore to undermine the entire rational discussion. How do we actually get through this? How are we going to move through this if we can actually not have a situation where two people with opposing views on vaccines sit in the same room?
Well, I think underlying all of these debates is that we at least sometimes get to the science in some public forums, but almost everywhere across American media, we don't talk about the corporate power of Pfizer and other pharmaceutical companies. And, I think RFK has said some claims around vaccines and pharmaceuticals that are, dubious and I'm skeptical of, but he makes other comments that you just don't hear in the public sphere that do ring true, which is that Pfizer and other companies spend hundreds of millions of dollars on television advertisements. That probably shapes the way we talk about corporate power and pharmaceutical companies on the major American media outlets. Even for the congressional Republicans who are talking all the time about investigating the mandates, investigating the CDC, investigating the Biden administration lies about vaccine and COVID policy, what they're not doing is subpoenaing the pharmaceutical companies, because Republicans, there are certainly more kind of realignment Republicans that are certainly more populist, but it's still a party that's largely funded by big business, that's largely funded by pharmaceutical companies. They're asking all the questions about COVID policy except the corporate power questions.
Well, fair enough, you might think, okay, I'm going to shy away from starting some massive inquiry into a company that it turns out might have given millions of dollars to my campaign. But what about the New York Times? What about these major investigative houses that should be, in some sense, independent? Why does it land with you on your Substack to be looking into Pfizer's back channels when in actual fact there are these huge organizations claiming to be doing effective investigative journalism? Where is it on the front page of the New York Times?
That's a great question. I'm informed by my understanding of these issues from historical reading of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Financial Times, other media outlets on pharma's influence over the years. I mean, this is not new. These strategies are more interesting because the mandates are so unprecedented. But these lobbying tactics, using civil rights organizations, medical organizations, patient organizations to kind of manufacture consent for various pharmaceutical policies, this is an old strategy. This is something that's been reported in the New York Times in previous debates. Why they don't take on this issue now? I mean, I don't have a direct answer for that. I don't have a causation here, but it's the New York Times and other media outlets have shifted away from more balanced journalism towards a little bit more of a partisan edge. The New York Times in particular made a huge fortune shifting to a subscription-based model with a more left-leaning Democratic Party base. And on a number of coverage areas, there are still dozens and dozens of incredible journalists and editors there. I don't want to knock their journalistic abilities at all, but the coverage has shifted over the years. It's become a slightly more partisan newspaper, and because COVID and vaccines have become this polarized issue, for any Democratic-leaning organization, left-leaning organization, any criticism of mandate policy or vaccine policy makes you immediately branded as anti-science or a threat to human health, threat to health. So I don't know, but why they're not doing this type of reporting that they have done in the past in previous debates, but they certainly aren't.
Perhaps this will be something that comes down the line. Maybe the reporting is yet to come. We can be hopeful about that. But during the time of COVID itself, I suppose the answer someone might give you from that newsroom is, look, it was a time of crisis. Sure. We were in a time of crisis where actually we had to batten down the hatches and everyone had to be on brand, on message, because of course, if we had any doubt sown about someone like Pfizer, then we might have mass vaccine refusal, which could have ended in disaster. So what would you say to them?
That's not journalism. Your job isn't to look around the room and nod along with everyone else. Your job as a journalist, even if it's unpopular, is to pursue the truth, to take the evidence, the facts, wherever they guide you, to question authority, to question public policy. I think a lot of journalists are terrified of how their reporting will be used by the wrong people. That's just not a good way to go about life. That's not a good way to go about media. Have trust in the reader. Of course, there are going to be charlatans and extremists that take your reporting and weaponize it for maybe an underhanded purpose. But the kind of broad New York Times or other reader, they can, if it's well-presented journalism, if it's fair, if it's fact-based, if it's put in context, they'll use it responsibly. And we'll have better policy, I think, as a result. But yeah, I think the kind of mindset that you're describing is exactly what happened during the pandemic. What if this is used by the wrong people? This leads to vaccine hesitancy. What if this helps the Republicans? What if this helps, the Trumpers? I mean, that's, and I've worked in left-leaning newsrooms for a very long time. I'm now solo on Substack for the last 2 months, and that's a sentiment that people obsessed over every day on every story, and it's very unhealthy.
COVID seemed to become a real perfect storm for this, though, in particular. And I do wonder if downstream of all of this growing mistrust, we will find ourselves in a situation where we do have, for example, a presidential election that's so dominated by the memories of this time and the what people are willing to say and not to say. I spoke earlier about RFK Jr., one of the presidential candidates, now polling at over 20% in the Democratic primary. I suppose a lot of his appeal to many people is that they feel he is saying things that other people are not allowed to say or their interests won't allow them to speak out about. So do you think the future of American politics is going to be in some way written by what's happened over the last few years?
Absolutely. I mean, just as the financial crisis in 2008 hung over the heads of American politics for perhaps a decade or more, I mean, for me, I think that's largely the reason we had elections like Brexit, like Trump, where after that kind of crisis where it exacerbated income inequality, it led to this mistrust of major regulatory bodies, of justice departments that didn't seem to prosecute the banks in the same way that they prosecuted ordinary people. There's this kind of two-sided sense of justice. There was a demand for some kind of sweeping outside voice to smash the system, to kind of, whether that was ever achieved with Brexit or Trump, that's a different debate, but that, I think, provided the underpinning for these momentous elections. And just as the 2008 financial crisis loomed over the events over the following 10 years, I think COVID, I think the uprising around George Floyd, it's remade America in many ways, made people question and wonder about the CDC and other public health bodies, about scientists and their role in shaping the debate around pharmaceutical companies. So we've had this complete realignment where the Democratic Party once championed itself as the biggest critics of Big Pharma, and now that they're the biggest champions on Capitol Hill and other public forums. And for the average voter, the independents, the kind of swing voter, I think they're uncomfortable with all this. And so they're open-minded to any kind of outside voice that's willing to kind of call into question a lot of these contradictions.
Do you think there's a kind of horseshoe situation that we might get into where anti-corporatism, anti-big pharma might become something that crosses over the aisle, left and right, and that actually we're entering into a new kind of politics that is either in the pocket of or outside of these kind of corporate interests?
Oh, absolutely. We're already seeing that in so many different ways. I've covered politics for the last 16 years. I've never seen congressional Republicans demanding clawbacks of banker bonuses. That's a big Republican bill now. For these, we've had a number of medium-sized bank failures earlier this year in the United States. There are Republican bills to claw back those bank bonuses. There are Republican efforts to investigate the FBI that's more aggressive than anything I've seen from a liberal. That the left have complained bitterly and I think accurately about the FBI for as long as I've been an adult, but I've never seen a politician so aggressive as the Republicans who are now going after FBI abuses. Big tech has been a problem for a very long time. And where I live in California, it's a lot of Republicans joining with independent-minded Democrats in proposing some of the most thoughtful regulations and proposals to counter the power of big tech. This is unprecedented. It's certainly not something that you saw 10 years ago under the Obama years. There was inklings of this in the beginning of the Trump years, but it's very new.
There's been a tainting of the whole of science, it feels, almost to the point where there are some people who at the beginning of the pandemic might have been perfectly trusting of their doctor when they would go and see them, who now won't be. What effect is that going to have on American life?
Well, look, there's been a study done that shows that even the pens and other kind of free goodies that are given to doctors shape their prescribing habits. It's astounding. And of course, these free golf trips and these paid speeches and other goodies do too. And look, that's been a problem for so many years in America. Hopefully, with this kind of opening of mistrust, it leads to a better form of ethics, a better form of medicine, new institutions or reformulated institutions that actually serve the public interest, not the bottom line of pharmaceutical companies. How this goes, I don't know. It is dangerous that I can see the potential harms of people not believing in any institution, any kind of medical or government entity, and getting lost in online conspiracy theories. That's a danger too. But the opening here is for real reform. There's been, every politician talks about reforming big pharma and medicine. Very few actually accomplish it. The Biden regulation, the legislation that I referenced earlier on capping the drug prices of the top 10 most expensive Medicare drugs that was passed last year, still pretty minor. We still have a lot of problems in terms of big pharma in America. We've got a lot of problems with disclosure and corruption and influence peddling. Let's hope that this window leads to an era of reform, but it's hard to predict.
Lee Fang, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
That was Lee Fang, former journalist at The Intercept, talking corporate interests that shape public policy, Pfizer's sponsoring of the vaccine mandates in particular, and informed consent, or perhaps psychological coercion, depending on how you think about it. We talked there about public trust in science post-pandemic and exactly what will happen to politics in the wake of this era. Thanks to him for coming on. To you for watching. This was UnHerd.